Hi there, my name is Axel Bruns, and this is the long-form version of our presentation for AoIR 2021. I'm presenting this on behalf of my colleagues, Michelle Riedlinger, Jean Burgess, and myself. So let's jump right in. To begin with, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we work, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, as the First Nations owners of the lands where QET now stands. We pay respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and we recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. We acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QET community. Our presentation here deals with the conversation, and that is a platform that perhaps needs a little bit of introduction. The Conversation is a publication that features scholarly and scientific content. It selects its content essentially via a crowdsourcing process, which means that scholars are able to propose new articles on their research and related topics and submit raw drafts of those articles. That text is then further developed by journalistic editors. Finally, the scholars have the final approval of those articles. So in some ways, we can call this journalism as a service. It is scientific research, it's scholarly work, and professional editing by journalists who look after those articles. That content is then published on the Conversation platform as a centralized and well-established platform. Further, the Conversation is also designed for shareability. All of its content is published under Creative Commons licenses, which means that many of the articles that it publishes end up being republished by major news outlets around the world, from CNN and the New York Times to the leading news outlets in specific countries, as well as to more specialist scientific publications as well. And of course, the content can also be shared widely via social media. And that's something that we will be focusing on particularly in this presentation. We're dealing here with the Conversation, and in fact, the entire panel that this paper is part of deals with the Conversation, in part also because 2021 is the 10th anniversary of the launch of the Conversation in Melbourne, Australia. So the Australian edition of the Conversation was the first of the number of editions that now exist around the world in a number of countries: the UK, US, Southern Africa, France, Indonesia, Canada, Spain, and there is also a global edition of the Conversation. In this particular paper, we're focusing on the Australian edition as the first to be launched, as well as the more recent Canadian edition, which launched in 2017. We are looking here specifically at engagement with Conversation content via Facebook. And to do so, we've gathered data from CrowdTangle, Facebook's data platform. In order to identify engagement, particularly in Australia and Canada, we're focusing here on posts on public Australian and Canadian pages on Facebook. That is pages where the majority of the page admins are identified as being located in Australia or Canada. We've gathered data for the entirety of 2020, so any posts that were posted on Australian and Canadian pages during this time. And in fact, we gathered data for any of these posts on Australian or Canadian public pages that contained a link to one of 41 Australian or 71 Canadian news domains, including in both cases the Conversation itself. The difference here in the numbers of domains is in part an indication of the high concentration of the Australian news market, where there are simply fewer major news outlets than there are in Canada. There are some obvious limitations to this, of course, because we are gathering data from CrowdTangle and because we are interested in Australian and Canadian pages only. We are dealing here with public pages only. CrowdTangle does not provide any information on non-public pages, groups, or profiles. And in fact, we're dealing with pages only because CrowdTangle only provides the location information for pages, not for groups or verified profiles. So that's an obvious limitation, but we believe that our data are still reasonably representative for broader patterns as well. Further, the location of the page admins is, of course, only a kludge. It does not necessarily directly translate into a country focus. For instance, the African edition of the conversation is also administered by admins in Australia. So in this particular case, the Conversation Africa does still show up in our data set as well, because it shows up essentially as an Australian page. By contrast, of course, pages that focus on particular topics, locations, interests in Australia or Canada may well be administered from outside of that country as well, if those pages have outsourced, for instance, their admin work to other countries. So there is only an approximation here of the actual page location and focus in this data, but that's unavoidable, unfortunately. And finally, of course, the coverage that CrowdTangle provides for public pages is somewhat limited. Particularly small and new public pages may not necessarily be covered by CrowdTangle yet. That again is unfortunate, but unavoidable. And of course, those pages with smaller followings may not yet be particularly consequential anyway. So again, this is something that we think we can live with. What we've done then for these two countries is an analysis of the linking and engagement patterns with the conversation content. So for Australia, we gathered a total of 1.4 million posts throughout 2020. That represents 410,000 distinct links to Australian news sites that were shared during this time. And it represents also an on-sharing of content in 271,000 posts. I'll get to the on-sharing part in a moment. In total, our data set is distributed over time like this. You can see the very obvious impact, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic, really starting from March 2020 onwards, which results in a significant increase in the sharing of content and the posting of links to content on Australian news sites, particularly for two leading news outlets, 7 News, a TV channel, and ABC, which is our public broadcaster in Australia. So they particularly became key sources during this time, and their links were shared particularly widely. In all of this, the conversation sits in a middling position, just outside the top 10, which is a fairly good positioning for a publication with a strongly scientific and scholarly focus. So what I'll present here, and what I'll present again also for Canada, is 2 networks. The first of these is a link sharing network. So this is a network essentially of links between Facebook pages and the domains that they are sharing, the Australian news domains that they are sharing. And that looks like this. So here we're seeing in orange and red the pages, the Australian Facebook pages that are sharing content, and in blue we're seeing the domains that are being shared. And we've highlighted there the conversation in red particularly. What we see from this is a pattern of clustering. We have a center to the network that consists of the ABC, a public broadcaster, of the Guardian Australia, of the Sydney Morning Herald, SMH, SBS, our other public broadcaster, the Age, another broadsheet newspaper, and a number of other sites as well at the center. And then down the bottom right, another cluster that consists largely of publications operated by News Corporation, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Courier Mail, news.com.au, the Australian, Sky News Australia, and a number of other publications as well. So there is some clustering here, particularly also around brand ownership, and this may also result, of course, from content being shared across these platforms. What we are seeing here is that conversation content in this network is shared predominantly at the center of that network by these publications, or by pages that also share publications in this network, in the center of the network, as well as some clustering around the conversation as a domain itself. So essentially pages that share conversation content also predominantly share links to the ABC, the Guardian, Crikey, the New Daily, and these other publications at the center of the network. pages that share the conversation do not very frequently also share content from the News Corp stable of publications. If we reduce this down to a network simply between domains, then that patterning becomes even more obvious. So what we've done here essentially is for each of the news domains to identify the other 5 news domains that are most frequently shared alongside them by Facebook pages in Australia. And that essentially provides a measure of affinity between these news domains. So what we're seeing here is that there is a strong affinity, for instance, between the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, the broadsheet Sydney Morning Herald, the Guardian Australia, the other broadsheet, The Age, SBS, and that the conversation is also on the periphery of that central cluster. We're seeing on the other side that pages that share news.com.au content, that's the middle of the road News Corp publication online, are also sharing News Corp content from a number of its newspapers, the Herald Sun, Courier Mail, Adelaide Now, Daily Telegraph, as well as from the pay TV news channel Sky News Australia. So again, we're seeing some very obvious divisions here, based in part on media ownership. The News Corp stable hangs together quite closely, and pages that share content from one of its publications frequently also share content from other of its publications. Some of these pages, of course, may be run by some of these publications, may be run by News Corp outlets or presenters, journalists, and so on. So this co-sharing of various News Corp links is not necessarily surprising. Somewhere in the middle, we see 7 News. That acts as something of a bridge. Pages that share 7 News content tend to share both content from the News Corp cluster as well as content from the other mainstream cluster as well. And the conversation, as I said, sits somewhere near the mainstream and somewhat center-left cluster there alongside ABC, Guardian, SBS, and other publications, other more minor publications in that cluster. So these are, broadly speaking, mainstream or center-left news outlets, whereas we've got the News Corp outlets, which tend to be quite conservative, sitting very much on the other side. So we can read this as an indication also of some degree of polarization in the Australian media landscape. Moving on now to the on-sharing network. So here we're looking within our data set only for posts that are being shared on from one page to another. So if we've gathered a post that contains a link to one of the 41 Australian news outlets, then here we're looking at whether these posts were also shared on by other pages in our network, and we're filtering that network only for that on-share. What that provides is a deeper indication of affinity of interests and topics, because on sharing someone else's Facebook post, another page's Facebook post, of course, tends to be an indication that there is some level of agreement, some level of interest at least in the content of that post, whereas simply 2 pages both linking to the same domain does not indicate the same level of shared interest and perhaps shared ideology as well. So that network looks like this, and there are some obvious clusters emerging within that network, which by manually reviewing the key pages and sources in that network, we've attempted to identify further, and this is what they look like. We have a number of clusters that are defined largely by location. So we have clusters for Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, and in fact, the cluster at the center that overlaps between national topics and New South Wales topics. We have some clusters that are defined by political orientation, conservative clusters and progressive clusters, as well as some broader issue clusters around the Me Too movement, around Indigenous issues. We have a sports cluster with the National Rugby League, the NRL there as well. So this is a better indication, it seems to us, of the themes, topics, interests, and ideologies represented in our data set as well. In this network, conversation content is predominantly shared on the progressive side, we see very obviously there that the pages that share progressive topics, that address progressive topics, and that sit to the left of the political spectrum tend to share conversation content much more than others. There is some sharing in the conservative cluster as well, but a closer look reveals that that sharing is largely in a critical context where articles being published in the conversation are being criticized and are being juxtaposed with other opinions that disagree with these articles. So sharing here does not necessarily represent endorsement of the points being made in conversation articles. Moving on to Canada then, and again, I'll present very much the same analysis here for this country. The volume of posts overall is fairly comparable, 1.5 million posts compared to the 1.4 million posts in Australia. We've identified nearly 600,000 distinct Canadian news links being shared in our data set, but far less on-sharing, only 83,000 Facebook posts being on-shared compared to 271,000 in the Australian case. That's interesting and not easily explainable. It's not entirely clear why Facebook pages in Canada that post news links should be more reluctant to share on other Facebook posts that contain news links. But we hope to explore this further and see if there is a fundamental difference in the way that Australian and Canadian pages use Facebook and on-share Facebook content. In the first place, again, looking at the overall patterns, there is here too an impact of the pandemic in March 2020, although that impact seems to be fundamentally focused on the global news outlets. Sharing of other outlets is less significantly increased. There are some slight increases for CTV News and CBC as well, but nowhere near as dramatic as they are for global news. There is also a curious drop down in mid-year for global news sharing, which again, we haven't been able to explain at this point. The conversation sits at a much lower position than the Australian version. That is in part, no doubt, due to the fact that it's a much younger publication in Canada, and that it hasn't simply managed to gain a similar market share yet in the country compared to the 10-year-old Australian version. Looking again first at the link sharing network for the Conversation Canada. So again, Canadian Facebook pages that share links to Canadian news sites. And here we tracked, of course, 71 Canadian news sites. This is the network that emerges overall. Again, our pages are colored here in orange to red, and our news domains are colored in blue with the Conversation highlighted in red. We see, again, a fairly obvious central cluster that emerges with some of the heavy hitters, Global News, CTV News, and CBC, particularly at the center of that network. We see some other clusters there, particularly on the left-hand side, that are related more to news ownership, again, to a network of news outlets that frequently share each other's content or post each other's content, rather, or in fact pages that are related to these outlets as well. Conversation content is not very widely shared in this network. That's the first observation to be made. Again, the Conversations market share in Canada is simply much lower than it is in Australia. We're seeing conversation content here shared largely by pages that also share some of that central content, CBC, CTV, and global news. And we see some pages that have arranged themselves particularly around conversation content as well. So there are some pages that share conversation content and not necessarily much other content from Canadian news sites. If we again reduce this down to the domain-to-domain network, the clustering in that network becomes more obvious still. Again, what we're doing here is to look only at the links between a domain and the 5 other domains that are most frequently shared alongside this first domain in our network. And we see there some obvious clusters emerge. The conversation, first off, is located somewhat on the outskirts of the central cluster, which contains CBC, Global News, CTV News, Globe and Mail, and the Star. So the conversation is near the mainstream, but it is also still very much on the outside of that mainstream cluster. And in fact, to identify these clusters further, so we have this cluster of mainstream news outlets in the first place. We have outlets that are owned by Pulse Media and tend towards the conservative end of the political spectrum in Canada. And we have a cluster here of community news outlets owned by the Black Press Group, which runs a number of local and community news sites. So again, these ownership clusters are in part most likely driven by the fact that pages operated by these ownership groups may well share content from a number of the outlets in that network. And so that's why these domains occur together with each other quite frequently. Looking at Canadian on-sharing, again, the data there is much more limited because on-sharing is not as frequent a practice in Canada as it seems to be in Australia. But again, we're looking here at Canadian Facebook pages that share the posts from other Facebook pages that contain links to Canadian news sites. So again, we're seeing some clustering emerge here. Some of this is once again driven by location. We have clusters here for Saskatoon, for Halifax, for Quebec, and the Quebec cluster sits somewhere on the outside of this network, which given the language differences is unsurprising. We have some clusters that are driven by political orientation. We have a conservative cluster, we've got a left cluster, we've got some issue clusters around Indigenous issues, around the Idle No More movement, and in fact, a cluster that seems to focus on the independence of Taiwan and Hong Kong. So these are clusters that emerge quite clearly here as well. And conversation content is shared here again much more in the progressive and issue-related clusters in this on-sharing network than anywhere else. It does not appear anywhere in the conservative network, not even as in order to criticize its content. There is some significant appearance of conversation content in Indigenous topics and in broader progressive topics more generally as well. So summarizing these findings and assessing the positioning of the conversation in these two news markets then, it's clear to say that in the Australian news market overall, there is a tendency towards some level of polarization. There is a centrist and possibly center-left cluster that contains outlets like the ABC, Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, and The Age. That is quite separate from the more conservative outlets operated by News Corporation. The generic commercial news broadcasters, news bulletins on commercial stations like 7 News and 9 News operate as something of a bridge or intermediary between these two clusters. So pages that share 7 News or 9 News content often also share content from either of these centrist or conservative clusters of outlets. 7 News appears as the most linked to news outlet in our data. However, with the caveat that 7 News itself operates quite a large number of Facebook pages that very frequently, of course, link to 7 News content. It operates pages essentially for the major cities and towns around Australia, and all of these pages link very frequently to 7 News content. So while numerically 7 News is the most linked to outlet in our data, if we look at all of the pages in our data set, for most of them, ABC News is actually the top linked domain. So the total volume of 7 News links is high, but that's largely driven by 7 News pages themselves, and ABC News content is most widely shared across the network. That's an interesting and somewhat unusual pattern, perhaps, that bears some explanation. Conversation content itself is shared fairly widely in the Australian network. It's obviously not a leading news outlet on Facebook in Australia, but it appears quite frequently across the network. However, mostly in centrist and center-left context, where it is being linked in conservative context, that's more often to criticize its coverage and to criticize the content being shared. For instance, as it deals with Indigenous issues, as it deals with climate change, as it deals with other contentious issues that scholars and scientists are making a contribution to. So the conversation has not necessarily managed to achieve full visibility and equal visibility across the entire Australian political spectrum, and certainly not full acceptance as a source of information across the entire Australian spectrum as well. In Canada, the overall shape of the network is largely centered around these major news outlets, Global News, CBC, CTV, plus those more regional networks, for instance, the papers operated by the Black Press Group. Again, we're seeing some difference here in the most linked to and most shared domains. So overall, numerically, Global News and CTV received the most links from Canadian Facebook pages. But if we look across these pages, for most of them, CBC is actually the most shared domain. So again, the public broadcaster in this case, much as ABC in the Australian case, tends to be very visible and very influential. But the total volume of links is somewhat inflated, perhaps, for these more commercial outlets by their own sharing activities. There is this somewhat strange, unexpected drop in the sharing of global news content since mid-2020, and we're not entirely clear what has caused this, whether this is perhaps a change in Facebook algorithms, in other activities. Maybe Global News itself has shifted its strategies away from Facebook. That's not entirely clear to us at this point and requires further investigation. Clearly in Canada, the conversation is not nearly as strongly established as it is in Australia. It is becoming visible in the center of the network, which should be encouraging for the conversation as a publication. But it certainly hasn't achieved the market positioning that the conversation has in Australia and perhaps in some other national contexts as well. Where it is visible in the on-sharing network, particularly, is in left-wing and Indigenous activism clusters, and that may also reflect some of the thematic focus of the Conversation Canada at this point, which has certainly published quite a substantial number of articles dealing with Indigenous issues in recent years. Now, finishing up then, just to return to the limitations of this study, again, we've only looked at public Facebook pages for Australia and Canada, and these were assessed by the locations of their page admins, which is an imprecise but unavoidable way of filtering for Australian and Canadian Facebook pages at this point. We cannot say anything about public groups because we have no location data on these groups or their admins. We cannot, of course, say anything about non-public groups or any other kind of non-public activity on Facebook, and that's a significant limitation, which is unavoidable again because of the lack of access to Facebook data other than through CrowdTangle. We speculate, but this remains speculation, that patterns that we see in public sharing and public posting on public pages on Facebook for these two countries may well be replicated in public and non-public groups, as well as in non-public profiles more generally. But there is no way for us to verify this without better data access to what happens on Facebook. We have, of course, at this point only looked at the sharing of content at the domain level. Further analysis can and will investigate also what content specifically is being shared most frequently. So what the themes of the conversation articles are, conversation content is that's being shared most frequently in both of these countries. That will also indicate, of course, whether particular themes, particular topics are perhaps particularly prominent in different clusters of the network as well. And at the moment, we're only here looking at the publishing or the linking to conversation content from Facebook pages specifically. We have not yet looked at conversation content that might have been republished in other outlets, for instance, in ABC, CBC, and other major local outlets in either of these countries. So it is possible that, of course, the reach of conversation content via republication is significantly wider than the reach of conversation content directly from the conversation website itself. So there are some further steps for our analysis to take, of course. We're interested in this thematic and article level analysis to see which topics are being shared most widely in what contexts and clusters in the network. We're interested in the change in sharing of conversation content over time, particularly also given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, which has focused attention much more on scientific content, particularly in epidemiology, but also in a number of other areas related to all of this. So it is quite possible that there is a substantial increase in sharing of scientific and specifically conversation content, of course, as a result of this ongoing crisis, and that possibly this results in a lasting repositioning and possibly lasting increase in the sharing of conversation content as more people discover this publication in this context and then continue to follow it afterwards. Finally, we're also interested, of course, in similar analysis in other platform contexts. We have data similar to this for Twitter as well, and we're interested in comparing here the sharing patterns on Twitter with Facebook, which may tell us something about the demographics of these platforms and the specific interests of users of these platforms particularly. But that's our study for the moment. We'd like to thank here our funders as well. This is funded by an Australian Research Council project in collaboration with the conversation, as well as by the Canadian SSHRC project, the Global Journalism Innovation Lab, which is, again, also focusing very specifically on the conversation. We're also supported by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. And of course, our Facebook data come from CrowdTangle, which at this point is one of the few points of access to Facebook data, even with quite significant limitations, of course. So thank you very much, and we look forward to your comments.